Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison's away this week. Delighted to have you back again today, and delighted to be back for our ongoing conversation on the future of God and the role that theism can play. And I'm really happy to welcome my colleague and friend Michael Putz to join me today in another discussion in this continuation of the future of God. It's been a great conversation and series of presentations this week, Michael, and huge gratitude for you for helping put all of this together, and really looking forward to having our friend and colleague Jan Byars with us today to continue the conversation on the future of God. So turn it over to you, and a big thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and a thank to Humanity Rising and you and Jim for wanting to actually encourage this program and holding space for that, and for you being the convener for all week. So you're holding a field of support for all of this, which I'm very grateful for. And I'm sure all the viewers know from the hundreds of programs you've supported here. It's a great privilege. So thank you very much. So today's program, it's going to be, I want to say a few words to begin with. Not quite like Jim's words, but my own words to begin the session. So we have a theme of the future of God before I introduce Jan, is that just to remind people who haven't tuned in earlier in the week, we were talking about the meaning crisis, and people have asked a few questions about what the meaning crisis is, and it's just basically, how do we make sense of this world together? How do we determine ultimate value? How do we navigate this life? So how do we make meaning? How do we create shared purpose, shared direction, shared value? And what the week is sort of inspired by is that we've had a meta crisis, which Humanity Rising has spoken a lot about, with climate change and all the other things going on in the world. But we've also had a mental health crisis in the West. And together, the meta crisis has met the meaning crisis. And we're at a particular point in our journey, as in Western cultures in general, of we're a culture that's sort of in between stories. People talked about them as myths, but basically the stories of what is of ultimate concern, meaning, what is the nature of reality, and what are we trying to do together as a human family? And the West has lost its old certainties and is now trying to navigate its way through the future. And in the interim, we've tried to deal with the meta crisis, and we have a meaning crisis at the same time. And so the question has been all week is that, does God can be part of the solution to the meaning crisis? And that seems like a strange question, but for many people, the rise of the nuns, but also the very idea of a shared narrative of meaning itself being anything more than an individual personal construct is a pretty common notion in postmodernism. So as we're trying to figure out how to make meaning and navigate the challenges of the 21st century, we have not only lost our old story, but we've also, even in some sense, lost our confidence in the ability to create a new story. So we're saying, like, what are some of the things that in the past that we thought were that we've left behind? Is there really a future for God as part of helping us solve the meaning crisis? And what do we mean by that? And one of the things we articulated during the week is that we're not talking about a pre-modern conception. We said the resolution to the meaning crisis would be developmental, perspectival, participatory, and relational, and especially relational and participatory. And that the ways we used to make meaning in our culture were very much propositional, about ideas and agreeing to concepts and ideas and processes and rituals. But we really need to get into this process of making meaning together in a relational, participatory way. And we're not trying to go back to old pre-modern certainties. And those ways of relating are not going to work going forward. But is there, on the other side of the modern and postmodern skepticism we've lived through, is there a postmodern engagement with God possible? And what does a postmodern conception of God look like? How's it experienced? How do we work together collectively? And we've had a couple of wonderful speakers this week who have talked about their individual processes of how they have gone through their own journey, and also how they've engaged other people in communities of participation, in discovering, as we're going to hear from Jan today, the field of love in a participatory way, another name for God in some ways. And So I want to introduce Jan Byars to come onto the line here and to learn from Jan about your very rich experience. Hello, Jan. It's a real privilege to have you here. I know Jan fairly well. I can't say I know her. I say well enough to know that the parts I know about Jan are just amazing. And she's got an incredible depth of practice. And I want to say depth of practice, right? Besides being a good human soul, the depth of practice, it backs up the goodness and the integrity that you have. And I really appreciate that. And I just want to say a few people have written comments and I have not responded to them because, first of all, I'm trying to focus on the speaker and the event. But during the week, I've seen a few comments go by in the periphery in the chat going, what about wholeness? What about David Bohm? And I'm like, you just wait for Jan. Just wait for Jan. She's going to talk about David Bohm. It's been an old favorite for some of us who've been doing this work for 30 years. A lot of us started by reading David Bohm, but Jan's deeply steeped in this material, but I don't think you're deeply steeped. You have a PhD, you're very knowledgeable about these things, but the important thing is you take that knowledge into practice. You're not just an academician or something like that. It's all about applying applying your work. And I think that's what I want people to gain from our conversation today is to be able to learn about how you knit together all of these different pieces, developmental psychology, meditative practices, mystical experiences into something practical for yourself and something you've been sharing with your clients and with other people in programs you've been running. So Jan, welcome. I can't wait to hear about your journey and the lessons we might gain from it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate both you and Tom including me in this event. And you're right about David Bohm and wholeness. That's pretty much my whole thing, although certainly there's many others that I'll talk about today. So normally I present on psychological functioning, how it impacts individuals and organizations. So I can get a little sciencey and maybe even a little psychobabble, although I'm keeping that to a minimum. But today's my story. So we have no slides, we have no charts and graphs. It's just something a little bit different. And my work is about how it impacts us individually, how it impacts our functioning, how we know it in our heart. Spiritual development, psychological development, but mostly getting out of our own way, of allowing and expanding. I have kind of a weird background. I started in fine arts, was an art director for 8 years in television, did not like it. Finally moved back to grad school, mental health, master's in mental health, psychological development in the classic sense. I was a therapist for a long time, working with severely abused children and their families, and really, well, trauma, that's a big word for nowadays. How do you get through it? How do you survive that? And I was able to sit with them and actually know that they could do it. Not just be nice and kind and all those things. Then I had another shift back to grad school where I took a deep dive into Bohm and wholeness and psychological development in a new way, expanded beyond traditional psychology. So my work is internal state. People think that internal state is just like private and you don't know about it, but you broadcast your internal state everywhere all the time. And it's important to see the alignment between our internal state and what's showing up out in our lives. My dissertation work, Bohm, interconnection, wholeness. In fact, I'll use his term. I was really struck by his original term for the holographic universe, which is undivided wholeness and flowing movement. So I will often refer to God or love in this talk as undivided wholeness. For me, it's interchangeable. For me, it helped me understand how God can be real outside of church or religion. So I'll be mixing in all of these different views and taking a look at this crisis of meaning, and how maybe it hasn't eviscerated God. One of the things that's really helped me is my strong sense of intuition. Right now, in fact, as we're talking about, well, maybe God has been eviscerated, I get this laughter sense, like, yeah, sure, like she's not affected. It's fine. We're allowed to have that thought. you know. So I process data a little differently, and that will be shown throughout this. So just be understanding that my intuition is a feeling sense in my body. It's like my cells know it. It's not a voice or a vision or anything so much. I get a knowing. So I'm going to share how I moved into knowing wholeness, how I can stay in that and find meaning even in all this crazy that we have going on. When I talk about love interchanged with wholeness or God, I'm not talking about emotion. I'm not talking about sentiment. It's not a mood. It's a presence. Teilhard de Chardin referred to love as one of the strongest forces in the universe, stronger than electromagnetism, gravity, or the strong or weak nuclear force. He considers it an actual function of our universe. And I'm using the word force because that's what they use in physics. I don't mean force as in power over. So as you can see, my story is grounded in silence and expands into possibility. Through my career, I've changed, I've expanded a lot. How do I find the power of love? Well, that's what my story is. But I know it's personal. It's not out there. It's not some old man with a beard. He, she, they are expansive. They're non-binary. Love is real. And we attempt to see it within the bounds of our own language, with our own limitations of our mind. And that's what kind of hooks us up. So we have to be willing to let her in. We have to be willing to be loved. And we have to let go of some of this crazy running around, this manic phase we're in as a society, which just armors us up. That's what limits our scope to know deeper. We have concepts, we have beliefs, we're taught by our family or society. I've learned by suspending them, by releasing them, not going crazy, just expanding beyond them and trying to see what else, trying to feel what else is there. So my primary practice is an expanded worldview. I'll suspend, I'll check, I'll see if there's some piece of something that I'm missing. I've come to learn that development, growing up and cleaning up of our mental and emotional selves is really critical. And it's our gateway to interconnection. We need to show up. We need to act with agency. Wilbur got all those parts right. So I work from a place of greater peace. I still have my stuff. I still have a life. I still have things happening with my computer that, like, why is it happening today? And it's our choice to release our constrictions, to allow love to be part of our lives, to show up.
So Jan, one of the things I think is really wonderful is that you've this place you've arrived, and I know a little bit about your story, but the interesting part of how you went through a journey that got you very logically and very spiritually to a place of atheism, Yeah,
That's where I started. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in some ways, from the perspective, I think I'd like you to share a bit about your journey to how you got to this place you're at right now, and also because it's almost like a textbook example of the developmental story, that these developmental sequences in some ways is like the journey you've taken, to me, is almost like a developmental unfolding as well as a spiritual unfolding into whole,ness all at the same time. And I think you
Yes.
could share a little bit about, where you started and how you ended up coming around to what could look like a very modern 21st century version of Christian mysticism.
So I started believing that young adult, 20s, early 20s, you had to be stupid to believe in God. I mean, like, wasn't that obvious? And I had one of those life experiences where I lost my job. The tower fell on a TV station. We were all laid off. And one day I'm driving across town to go visit a friend, and it's just a regular stop sign, right? Just normal. And I remember kind of turning my head in this sort of slow motion way And there was a church there, and I got that knowing, that intuition that I described to you earlier. You can believe in God and be an intelligent person. Like, no way. Absolutely not. It completely shocked me. Like, what was funny is I didn't question the knowing. Like, that was so normal for me that it didn't occur to me that that might be a spiritual experience. But we'll get back to that in a minute. So I had this absolute knowing in my body that I could believe in God and not be stupid. It was a shock. I wanted to know if it was true, right? It galvanized me into action. I started reading like crazy. I still have my copy of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads. I went all the way through Carlos Castaneda. So many more that we can't even begin to list. But let me just say my scope was wide. And I want to understand I'm still using that discernment. Is this true? Is there something here for me? Does this make sense? So it wasn't like I was just taking it all in and assuming everything fit my worldview, right? About a year later, I began a silence practice. I started from a Buddhist perspective. I was not seeking enlightenment so much as I had less pain when I sat in silence for 20 minutes a day. It was a less, your 20s, you know, they're terrible. Like, well, how do I do this? How do I do that? What's going on? All this stuff. So I just had 20 minutes of peace every day. It was a blessing. It expanded my reality. I did all sorts of more reading. I began to have spiritual experiences. I didn't really know what those were. So for a little while, I shut those down. They seemed maybe crazy. About 3-4 years later, I was in this job I hated. And it's like, all right, I've got to figure out something else. And so I thought, well, if there's a God and I'm allowed to believe in it, I need help. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? So it was basically a prayer, although I didn't know that that's what I was doing at the time. And not very long after, I mean, really quickly after, I found a group of people. They helped support me, kind of helped me walk through. That got my attention. I could ask for help when I really needed it. Now, not for little personal things. There was not like a personal relationship here yet. This was still kind of at a distance. I was still reading. But hey, there's this emergency help button. So I used that emergency help to shift my career, go back to grad school. And meditation helped me stay humble enough to see, wow, I was going to really have to shift my lifestyle and different things that it took for me to go back to school. So I started in a master's in art therapy. Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, all these wonderful, expansive things, collective unconscious. I loved the learning. And just before my internship, they closed the program. I was not happy. I was not happy at all. I dropped out of school for a quarter. It's like, and then I realized sitting there in my silence doing my practice, I could change my major. But see, when you're mad and you're all upset, you can't see, oh, I could just go fill out a form and turn it in and boom. And here's the big thing. I just switched my major now to a program that gave me a license, an independent license, ultimately, where I could have my own practice. I would have never been able to do that as an art director. So this was a huge gift. I didn't see it for a while, but it was a miracle. It was a blessing that I didn't know. So there was a big debate going on when I was in my master's, and it kind of fits this. It's the social science versus the physical science world. Is it nature that shapes the child? Is it the nurturing and the holding environment of the mother? And there was this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It was hostile. It was unnecessary. And we just had a whole degree on mental models and how they shape our reality. So I thought it was kind of funny that these people who are trained like are fighting over a mental model. Do we have that argument anymore? No. Why? Because we've expanded beyond it. It's not just nature, heredity. Heredity is important. Nurturing, how the environment holds the child, very, very important. And it's your agency. What do you do with it? How do you show up? The problem disappeared. It's not even talked about anymore. I was watching an old show from the 90s, and they were talking about this thing. And it's like gone from our minds. We don't even remember as we were arguing about it. So
Jan, I'm thinking
go
about,
ahead.
you mentioned like this, the nature versus nurture sort of like was a debate for such a long time. And then it sort of disappeared in a higher order wholeness that integrates the insights.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
I'm thinking that, and not just, but I'm just excited that I think I feel that you're leading us to where some of these issues about the pre-modern God and the modern and postmodern skepticism and atheism become both are in communication with each other. And somehow, I think through your own life journey, the things that are like, you know, red versus blue, all of a sudden resolve into a different higher form of wholeness.
Right. So if we can calm down enough and listen to ourselves, to each other, there is more information, right? We forget how small of the spectrum of the light spectrum we can see. We forget how small of the spectrum of what we can hear. And by that, I'm using it as an example to say there's so much more out there than what especially if we're stressed, we're taking in about this much data. So, and yet that's the opposite of when you're overwhelmed, you want less data, you want less stuff going on. Anyway, so also in my master's program, change wasn't possible. If you're depressed, you are just what you were at 7, heredity, right? Take meds, biochemistry, nothing you can do. I knew that wasn't true either. So we've learned how to rewire our brain. That's the slang term, right? Create new neural nets, think newer thoughts, start to let them become part of who we are. And without that rewiring, wholeness isn't an option. Wholeness doesn't exist because it's beyond our capacity. It's beyond that range that we're willing to see. So expanding perception, resolving conflicts, obviously these are all relevant here. The 2 big things I learned in my master's was psychological development, this growth process that we go through, and holding environment, that the environment that we hold in, especially if we're holding it from wholeness, we change. We don't change people's behaviors. We influence, we shape. It's holding environment became a significant component. I'll talk about it here in a minute. So school for me was Piaget, Erikson, traditional developmental people, not Wilber. Wilber wasn't really a name. Development's natural, it's going to happen. And it's both internal, meaning our brain structure, our neural nets, our memories, our wiring, and, we can see the child walk, we can see them talk. Those are external things. The problem is these milestones go through our whole life. Erikson has milestones to very old age. And by very old age, I'm talking 90. So we don't stop developmental milestones at 20 or 18 or 25, whatever it is now. Unfortunately, we don't recognize any of those. We stop basically at college, and we have a whole bunch of adolescents running our world. And the problem is you can't come to know wholeness from an adolescent perspective. We have so much shadow in our way, so much of our old beliefs, old habits, old ideas, which we haven't been willing to suspend because we're not willing to allow wholeness to show us a slightly different way of thinking, listening to that conversation with someone that's very different than you. So our developmental milestones for the vast majority of us, since we are not in very old age, is self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-correction. These are our minimal levels of development, needed for leadership, needed for showing up, needing for emotional intelligence. Sometimes we use that word, needed for growing up. These are the tools for growing up. So holding environment influences and changes behavior. So as people who influence organizations, we have an opportunity to hold an environment that heals, that supports, that helps grow people versus a toxic environment, which I think we know is the vast majority of people. Anyway, I worked for a number of agencies, was gifted with the opportunity to actually learn how to hold an environment for mental health residential programs, both for staff and the children. It wasn't like, if you're just serving your clients, you're holding a good environment. No, if your people hate where they work, you're not holding the environment right. What was amazing to me is how shockingly bad these working environments that I was in, even though everyone was licensed to know holding environment and aberrant behavior and all these different things, they all should have known. And wow, they didn't. So an environment that heals, an environment that's based in wholeness, is like a completely different space to be. And this is where I decided, these organizations are really screwed up. And it seems so clear that interconnection is real. It seems so clear how you hold an environment. I mean, I went to school and then I just started doing it and it worked. So it wasn't that hard. And that's where I came into understanding quantum holographic theory, which I integrated with values-based leadership from an internal perspective. And this is where David Bohm shows up in my life. Psychological development, holding environment are critical to take a deep dive into our interconnection. The overarching reality of wholeness, it's just right here. But it took all these things that I've just told you about for me to be able to see it. These profound intuitions, these reading all sorts of different views that I would have never been reading normally. It took understanding how I have to grow up. I have to clear my stuff. And no, I'm not done. To be able to sense it. So wholeness is here. Wholeness is right now.
Jan, just to jump in real quick, the relational therapist Terrence Real talks about each of us are operating in the world with our wounded child, our adaptive child, and our wise elder. And what the journey that you're talking about that you've been on tracks very nicely with his work. And so many of us, if we haven't done our attachment work and developed a healthy attachment and awareness of our attachment, our wounded child can oftentimes still be in charge. Yes. And our adaptive child can still be running our life. To your comment about what in Terrence Real's work, the adaptive child as opposed to the wise elder showing up, post education, post school in the workplace. And so I just love how you have been tracking in the way you have and arriving at that place of David's work, David Bohm's work around wholeness, which does require the repair of the wounded child and the adaptive child.
Right. And the repair's not fairy dust. We don't just go, oh, I have a wounded child. I have still pieces left of me that are the wounded child. The difference is I know what it feels like, the reaction feels like in my body. Maybe not the first second. Like it could be showing up for a little bit, right? But then it's like, oh, and you pull yourself back in. And we'll talk about that physiological shift that we have to make. First of all, we have to be able to be aware of it, right? So all that kind of work, again, we're not trying to get through. It's a process. It's a journey. You're going to always have your little, Bohm calls them biochemical reflexes. It's a scar. Like if you think about, you have a scar on your arm and it gets touched and we don't even realize how physically based that is, right? Our emotions are stored, and when they get released, when they get triggered up, when we remember, whatever it is, all the electromagnetic pattern, all the biochemistry comes shooting out in us. And we think it's real because it feels real and I remember it. So this is reality. And it is in the sense that you're at a trigger, but it's not reality. It's a minuscule, tiny little piece of wholeness, which you can step out of. So when I got to grad school and I was writing my dissertation, Chalmers came out with his Big Theory U book, which is another understanding of wholeness and how you move through the U and you can expand your perception. And I was so worried because this was so obvious to me. It's like, oh, if he published, like I have to start over. Like I can't use my topic, right? Like this is a big problem if you're in your PhD and you're like more than halfway through. And he didn't. He didn't touch the individual state. He talks about the group moving through, and the group moving through is very good and important, but that's not my work. My work is how do you internally set yourself up to allow wholeness to participate in your life, if you will, at least consciously participate. She's participating anyway. So I wrote my dissertation, Staying Straight Science, right? Undivided wholeness was my term. For me, it has a bit of spirit to it. So there was that piece, that personalness that was starting to develop, but I stayed straight on that line of science. And part of my ability to survive the stress of a PhD program was without a doubt part of my silence practice, that capacity to sit in absolute crazy. So David Bohm's book, Thought as a System, basically says the same thing I learned in my cognitive behavioral training and placed it within undivided wholeness. And this is those biochemical reflexes and those triggers and that trauma response and all this biochemistry flooding our body. And we can't see beyond it if we can't calm down. So the silence practice can be walking in nature, right? It can be, you don't have to sit on a Buddhist cushion and do it that way. So until we can become aware of who we are inside and how our state is impacting us, we have no capacity to see and know wholeness. I'm exaggerating, right? It will come in brief moments, like the moment in my car when I was driving to see my friend, but there won't be a sustained knowing. It won't be personal. And of course, personal is how it becomes more meaningful. In his seminal work, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, his very first paragraph on the first page, page 1, talks about how our fragmentation is so serious that it has led us to a general confusion of the mind and that we can't solve the problems of our day. This was published in 80, 81, I can't remember. I think it was 80. So, you know, this is when linotype was each little letter in lead was, so it took a year and a half, 2 years to publish this book. So decades and decades, this has clearly been written out. He uses different language than my psychological training, but it's the same thing. We get caught in our perceptions and we have seriously impaired our view, our capacity to solve problems. This is a problem. And when we can sit, even when the world isn't good, which, you know, is a lot, and we can hold, even if you just know wholeness is real, even if you just get to the point, which is ultimately how I got to it. God is real. Wow, God is real. Wow. I prefer the language of wholeness to God, but it's right here. And it's a shift in my perception. It's a shift in my clarity that allows me to be part of it. The other thing that I discovered that was really important is how much our heart, and I'm talking our physical heart, well, we'll talk about the spiritual knowing too in a minute, but the physical heart is necessary for clarity and capacity. We have all this research on neuroscience, this and neuroleadership, that, blah, blah, blah. And of course, the brain is important. And of course, biochemistry is important. But the heart holds the environment for the brain. The heart creates more neurotransmitters than the brain. The heart sends the pulse up to our neocortex, which allows for that steadiness of thinking or the craziness the jumbledness, the frantic fragmentation. The heart creates the largest electromagnetic field in our body. The brain has one, you know, EMGs are good. EEGs, sorry. But our heart field extends out like 10 feet, 12 feet. It's real. When we're sitting at a conference table with people, we're in the same heart field. That pulse, that frequency impacts. And it's through our heart that we're connected to wholeness. So when I'm in that calm, clear place, and my heart rate variability is this nice, smooth place, I'm connected, consciously connected. I'm always connected, but I know I'm connected. I'm sitting in undivided wholeness. It's a great place to be. It doesn't make my car start or some of those things that might be happening in my life. But wow, there's a presence, there's an expansiveness, there's a reality to what some people would say isn't true. When you put together the heart field and the understanding of knowing wholeness with things like the collective unconscious from Jung and the symbology and all the things that he shared, they don't line up absolutely perfectly. Well, first of all, they're completely different disciplines. And of course, we want to keep those separate because we want to make sure everything is divided into little pieces. But there's so much overlap. And this is how wholeness became spirit or love or God for me. There's a whole branch, well, mysticism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The mystical aspect of Christianity talks about your heart being the organ of spiritual perception. And when you're in coherence, when you're in this clear, calm place, it's a very, very different feeling tone is my word for it. Because again, I feel it in my body. So I came to understand wholeness right here, right now. Not the pushing and the shoving and the force that we always use to get through our day. We forget that force creates an equal and opposite reaction, and yet we use it all the time. Maybe you don't honk and yell at people while you drive, but we all have our own way in which we're used to running. Most of us will wake up with that, oh my God, oh, I forgot, oh, I have to. And before you even get out of bed, you're out of coherence. It's such a sad thing. People don't know how to not have their music on or not have constant noise, not have constant really arguing if you look at our social media. So my work was applying interconnection to leadership, to this coherence, to this integrity in both senses of the meaning, showing up with truth and honesty, but also showing up with this very clear sense of self and acting aligned with who you are and what your passion is. So I came to know how important clarity and calm was. It's our cornerstone of our mental health, of course, and it's also the cornerstone of our spiritual formation. It also leads to excellent leadership. I'm going to take a drink here. Just one second. The internal calm shows up in our functioning. Talk about levels of development. And of course, levels is a masculine term. We can have development without it being vertical. What we have to clear to get to that higher functioning, to knowing wholeness, is our sense of urgency. Becoming aware of our state, adapting so that we can adapt to changing environments and create a nurturing place. Nurturing tends, almost any female term has a negative connotation. It doesn't mean weakness. It means safety. It means kindness. So as we move out of fragmentation, that inner voice, that still small voice, can become present. We don't have to force our way. When I have a situation like creating a presentation, I'm expanding out first. I have to drive it down and figure out what examples I'm going to actually use. But I start with, what could it be? What would I want? And those are straight, I mean, that's straight fine arts, right? Like that's how you would create a painting. That's how you would create, that goes straight back to my undergraduate degree. It's a creative problem solving. It's nonlinear. I don't go boom, 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 boom. We still have this old belief in science, I've already been talking about it, right? Where we separate everything into little pieces. Now, it's fine, it's good. We learn more about the liver by studying the liver by itself. And we have to put it back into the whole system and how it affects all of us. And we still haven't done that. We're not even close. I'm not saying it's not out there. I could go find a doctor that would look at that, but I have to look. It's not like the regular training. So it's called the Enlightenment, right? We all know about this. Mid-18th century, we separated spirit. Spirit was over here now. And science is now here and building and budding and growing and basically kind of pushing spirit out. And of course, it was given all sorts of meanings, like it was stupid, right? Like what I believed at the beginning, that it's not real, that, you know, it's a fantasy, that it's all these things. And I mean, sure, you can go that way. There are people that become fanatical, but there are people that become fanatical about any topic. We can't understand wholeness if all we're looking at is the smallest piece. We have to put it back together. We have to put it back together for our society, but just for our own peace, just for our own capacity to live. And of course, with people like Bohm, we are rediscovering wholeness. Not that she went anywhere. But separation has become our fatal flaw. It's the mental model, if you will, that we need to revise and question. Science is great, but it has lots of blind spots. And of course, it's taken the place of God. So I finally got through my PhD, completely fried my brain, completely exhausted. I wanted out of my head. Having learned the importance of my heart, it's like, okay, how do I center in my heart again? How do I make that my primary? What I discovered in grad school, one of those impressions, intuitions, if you will, that I had was, if I'm in my head and my brain's spinning, I have a lot of education, you know, my brain's pretty good. I can think through things and solve problems pretty well. But I completely leave out my intuition. I leave out my heart, that bodily knowing, being grounded, all these words that we know. If I center on my heart, I still have all my education. I still have all my knowing. I still have all my learning. I can still use logic. And I can go with that intuition. I can feel that sense of, ooh, something's not right here. I should rescan that. I can't tell you how many times that saved me. Little intuitions. Sometimes they're instantaneous, like deer. And I hit the brake and oh, boom, a whole herd of deer. I did not mediate that one. I did not sit there and go, I wonder if this is a real intuition. My foot was on that brake. Sometimes I have bigger ones like the one I shared. And I spent 15, 20 years mediating. Is God really real? Is that true? So it's not an intuition becomes your brain. It doesn't become your capacity for thinking. It becomes your voice of wholeness. And now we have to just calm down enough to listen. So I know my meditation practice continues, but here's the thing, I had to get out of my head. Meditation in a traditional sense is a focal point. You have a mantra, you stare at the light of a candle, you focus on your breathing, and you use that focal point to keep all this from happening, all the mind running. And that's great. And it served me for 24 years. So very good. But centering prayer is in the heart. And it's more of a surrender process. There's the very beginning, you have a prayer word. But every time some thought comes through, you just let it go. And you let it go. And you let it go. So you release attachment. I realize there's a hair's breadth difference between these two practices. But for me, I need it in my heart. And so I switched to centering prayer. And of course, that led me into a mystical understanding of Christianity, away from all the shame and the guilt and, you're going to go to hell and all the stuff that I have no tolerance for. And it allowed me to be more present, to once again step a little deeper out of the crazy, and to release my attachment to every thought. And that's the critical thing of development. If we think every thought that we think is true, we're not going to let it go. We're not going to suspend it. We're not going to go, how does that fit into wholeness? We're going to hold on. We're going to ram it through. We're going to convince everybody that it's right. So this mystical knowing that centering prayer is based on led me back in to Christianity. I moved deeper on the path. Of course, I started the reading and the learning and attending retreats and wisdom schools, same as always, diving deep into the stuff, the literature. And I continued to look at that by expanding beyond it and making sure it fit. Mystical Christianity is based on original blessing. There's no original sin. He did not die for our sins. He was a gift. Obviously, my belief and a few others. But God isn't the church. And we tend to confuse that. The church has some issues, baby. God didn't do all of those things. They were manipulated by man. So I found a lineage into Christian mysticism. It's always been there. We just never hear about it. There's a Benedictine monastic practice, which has this certain rhythm: work together, work alone, prayer together, prayer alone. It was a rhythm of life. I could see how that very easily would fit into that coherent state that I was talking to you. The cloud of unknowing was the original theological basis for centering prayer, where one surrenders and sits in silence. And of course, there's Teresa of Avila's interior castle. And she has a developmental path to unitive life, unitive state. Most people Christians don't seem to even know there's a unitive state. Like it's the same as, or roughly the same as enlightenment in Buddhism. And it's been there. I mean, Interior Castle was written in the 16th century and it wasn't new. She was just said, hey, write this book. She was told to do it. It's the closest we have to know self. As a Christian, it's the closest we have to know self. There's still a teeny tiny bit of self. So it's slightly different than Buddhism. It's more like a fractal. Become a fractal in the heart of God, a small light that still shines. So most of what you think of as yourself, of course, doesn't exist. Of course, I don't know this is true. This is just what I've come to understand. St. Teresa describes a circling inward. It's not a ladder. We've gotten rid of that masculine model. We're circling in, circling in. In the beginning, just like I learned in grad school, our minds are filled with reptiles and lizards. Even in the 16th century, people had trouble letting go of their thoughts. The first two mansions are the reptiles and lizards. They begin to recede. And then the third mansion is where you realize that God is not pouring into you, but arising up within. I would say that's true of wholeness. It's arising up within. It's coming from your heart. It's an internal to external presence. This is why all that internal work is so important. And from that internal knowing rising up, you gain greater clarity. You gain greater knowing, greater insight. You gain greater peace. The fourth mansion is where you're conquered by love, where you find God for sure, like every minute. James Finley has a course on the interior castle through the CAC. And here's a quote that he says from St. Teresa. The transition into the fourth mansion is the opening to the intimacy, to the unexpected realization that God is already all that you are. That to me is a profound statement. God is already all that you are. Wholeness is already all that you are. Love is already all that you are. There are a few more mansions about that, but I don't really feel like I could speak to them, so we'll leave them off. This is the beginning of the unitive state, this knowing God is already all that you are. And my last mystical person that I love, that's been a significant influence, is Teilhard de Chardin. He was a scientist and a priest, a paleontologist. He believed that evolution and creation were the same. You can imagine the Catholic Church's response to that. Yes, he was exiled for the remainder of his life. All he did was mention it to a friend in a letter. He didn't take out any ads or put up any billboards. He just was saying, hey, doesn't this seem like it would be true? He was first sent to China not long after World War II started, so he was really stuck, like he wasn't even coming home for visits. And he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. In The Human Phenomenon, he literally, from a scientific perspective, outlines exactly how creation and evolution are the same. It's not an easy read, but it's a great book. It's exceptionally detailed, explicitly clear, and only drives home the point of wholeness to me. Science and God aren't fighting. It's not nature and nurture. These writings have been published for over 50 years. Now, he wasn't allowed to publish them, of course. So he left all of his books to his secretary, and she, of course, published them on his death. So we had this whole new worldview. Again, not new. These have been published since the 50s, maybe. That's a long time, 70 years. Teilhard helped me see a Christianity that's not based in shame and guilt. It's very much based in love. And it doesn't make any difference what you call it. Undivided wholeness, Buddha consciousness, Christ consciousness, love, they're all good. God does not care. I have a quote by Carl Jung on my wall in home: bidden or unbidden, God is always present. So for me, God is love now. God is personal. God is real. Our Western traditions have cut it all up in little tiny pieces and say they don't fit together. They fit together beautifully. Actually, Rumi had it right. I've altered his quote just a tiny bit for today. Out beyond ideas of postmodernism and religion, there is a field. I will meet you there. So this is where I'm at now. I actually joined an Episcopal church recently in the little town outside of Indy. It's a great, loving community. There's no shame and guilt. There's opportunities for service and community. Community is important. Learning how to take this calmer, clearer self out into the world. It's why we would do it. You can see how all these different learnings have shaped me, have shaped my reality. I can sit in ambiguity. I can tolerate craziness out there.
Well, Jan, the framing that Michael has shared with us this week is that the future of God is developmental, participatory, and relational. And you've done such a beautiful job of talking about the developmental piece in your life's journey. And just, it's a beautiful journey. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today. I unfortunately need to leave for another commitment, but I would love for you and Michael to continue the conversation. We've got a very active chat today, and clearly you're resonating with the audience. And I would just encourage you both to continue the conversation for as long as there's juice and energy and God's present, and certainly love. And love you both, and really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. So just, Jan, I was in the state of wholeness. I was like lost in it about 20 minutes ago. And
that's what people don't understand is when you're in wholeness, other people join you there.
Well, yeah, it's fun. We know. We it's like it oftentimes happens. Yeah, it's a surprise for people. And I was just, I was thinking I was supposed to interject in some places, and I'm like, no, not now, not now, not now.
I kept waiting for you, kind of waiting to see if you wanted to talk. But
it's funny that the point is, I realized the state of wholeness was saying, go. And I had to just go. And I was surprised. I was thinking I was going to interject more. And I just want to say I was literally trying to be in the field of wholeness. And actually, you got to the fourth mansion. Is that right? The language, right? So
that's the last one I talked about. Yeah.
Right, but it's like it wasn't appropriate until the fourth mansion, because what's really sort of this interesting journey, and there's always these thoughts about like, well, how did that change your outer practice, your life, your work, your relationships? But the point was the journey had to go all the way through to the fourth mansion for me, because what I think people felt, I think people were saying, where is the wholeness in the week, and there's like, there's a bunch of men here talking right now, and so there's the mystical, and there's also the feminine, and there's all this stuff, and this is a practice of holding that field today, as much more than the content itself. The content is like invoking. It's like a liturgical practice in Christianity. People think that there's all these rituals, and people have to do these boring rituals. Well, if they're boring because the undivided wholeness isn't present. So if you're in like a Buddhist or a Christian perspective, the liturgical practice, if it's working, should put us into a state of individual and collective wholeness. And that liturgical practice then makes sense. Why are we singing these songs or saying these prayers? It should really be a technology to facilitate and help us come into resonance with our heart and resonance with each other. And so in some ways, you had to go all the way to that practice. And then you're coming around to a normal Episcopal church. And I say normal, I'm sure a wonderful congregation, but they're not, the average parishioner isn't knowing about St. Teresa. The average parishioner isn't talking about David Bohm, but
I'm teaching them though. I'm doing some classes.
You're coming in, and this is something that I think is really essential that comes out of the journey, but it only can be said when you get to the capstone of it all, is that what's happened is that people oftentimes are not in their wholeness because of trauma, right? We talked about
absolutely.
that. So they're out of integrity at all. And then there's the question of like, they're sort of there. You know, the average person is like, I'm okay, I'm doing all right. They're not broken, but they're not coherent. There's a difference. There's an intermediate state of like, you know, there's wellness and there's not sick, and then there's like okay in the middle. You know, it's like
Right.
someone's, I'm not truly thriving,
Mhm.
but I'm not broken. And
Yeah.
a lot of people are in their semi-wholeness, right? But what's interesting is that what happens is if you have this personal practice, and it's also your work, because what you can do as a coach, a facilitator,
Mhm.
you know, a teacher of this material, is that you can then bring that wholeness that you have at a different when you higher vibrational state,
Right.
and then people can then access that wholeness and borrow from it. And then using Wilber's language about state and stages, they can experience that for a moment. They're elevated. It's like our best selves are elevated. And someone goes like, wow, I'm here right now feeling that wholeness that Jan's helped me bring me to. That's where sometimes if we have a spiritual leader who's running a workshop, that they hold a higher vibration and wholeness, we can then go, that's in me, and I can be in that state. I can't stay there where this other person is, but I can go, wow, I'm here right now, resonant with it. And that has very practical implications for effective coaching, effective leadership of a team, organization, trying to make change and transformation as you're able to provide a wholeness that's at a different vibrational level and different stage. And you can then bring it to the field and then help elevate everybody else and to let them find that in themselves. And
Right.
it's such a powerful practice that if you go all the way up, you can just be in the business environment. You're not talking about any of this stuff, but people are experiencing it.
Well,
And
I do talk about wholeness because
I'm saying you
wholeness is
can, but
scientific.
I'm saying you can talk about it. But the
Yeah.
point is, even if you don't say a word,
Yeah.
they're going to that it's the silent, it's like the Eastern traditions oftentimes say, you know, the master would transform the person through a simple conversation, right? The
Mm.
person would be talking about some kind of task, and then they'd realize the person had been transformed through the being in the field of wholeness with the master, right? And so it's a very practical thing to develop this consciousness, not only for yourself, but for the work we want to do in the world, and the fact that we have a meta crisis and we have a meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And sometimes the challenges I wanted to say is earlier on is that, you know, it's funny, people from the traditional level have an undivided wholeness.
Oh, absolutely.
They have an undivided wholeness. The challenge is it's not matching it's not able to handle the flood of brokenness in the world that's coming at them, and it's also not able to handle sometimes the complexity of the world they're perceiving. So the traditional world is the world's pouring in on them, right? So there's a wholeness, but there's a breaking apart, and it has to be brought back together at a higher level of consciousness. But then there's the modernist and postmodern consciousness, which is like there's a mental block to that wholeness, saying I can't have that wholeness because it's not possible. It doesn't fit my worldview.
Mhm.
And in some ways, you can talk all day long about the science and try to, but
Mhm.
the thing that's going to push someone over the edge, you may need to give them languaging to make them go, oh, there's a sciencey way of understanding. There's wholeness
Oh,
available to
yeah.
me as a scientist, as a skeptic, as a postmodernist, as a materialist.
Right.
I need words and language, you know, whether it's Brene Brown or, you know, Richard Rohr from CAC, giving me language that let me dive in. But the thing that makes the difference is the field of coherence that you create. And then someone goes, I hear your words, but now I feel and understand. And that's the power of your work. And that's the power of who you are and what you're teaching, is that they may never know about Saint Teresa of Avila. You know, maybe if you get people who work with you long enough that you look at to know that. But
Actually, I don't normally talk about it in Christian terms. This is one, other than maybe if I'm teaching a class at church, I'm staying science, baby. Like
well, no,
that's
I'm
yeah.
saying maybe if you had somebody, if you worked with them
Oh,
deeply enough, they might take that journey with you.
right.
But that field of wholeness you have is available no matter where they're at in their journey, no matter what they're capable of, no matter how fragmented or
Yeah.
unfragmented they are, or whether they're in a materialist mindset, they're going to go, what is that? What happened here?
Mhm.
And and that's more powerful than words or PowerPoint lessons or Wilberian models and stuff like that. I find the stages and that kind of stuff helpful to understand where people are coming from,
Mhm.
but it's not the way to shift them from where they're at to where they want to be. It's the practices you've been talking about
Right.
today.
And there's never force, right?
Oh, no, no, no.
If all we do, if I go into an organization, there's never force. No one has to do anything. But you start with just bringing their heart into coherence. Like just start with stress management, resiliency, like things people want. Like I need that. There's a sense of hope that kind of bursts out into the organization when they realize, oh, oh, I I'm going to be taken care of. They're going to help me calm down a little bit. They're going to help me settle a little bit. You know, my work is still my work, but whew, I
But
can take a few
what,
breaths.
and the other thing I wanted to say was you talked about that stop sign and you had that experience, and then you came to a point in your life where life was sucking, and you said, I need help. And you said it was sort of a prayer without being a prayer. And you realized, well, I asked for help and I got it. So this is pretty good. I want more of that. And, and then you basically got in tune with the intuition, saying, I need to listen to my intuition. But what's interesting to me, and I want to hear what your response is, but I sort of had the feeling there was a theme that had to be experienced instead of articulated, that I thought there was a sub theme here in your presentation of learning that deeper trust and actually saying there's a resource that is beyond, if you don't want to think of it, someone could say this scientifically and say, I don't believe in God per se, but there seems to be a source of of help and intelligence that is more than egoic mind for you, right? That it came to you,
Absolutely. Yeah.
existence
It's
and synchronicity and intuition. But I wanted to say that the thing I got at the end was at the ultimate level, when Saint Teresa is going through the different mansions, it's not necessarily a ladder. You know, she talked about circles, but
mm-mm,
there is this radical increase. We have these words like synchronicity or intuition. At the deepest level, it's this ultimate level of being in resonance with mystical possibility, the mystical language. It
mhm.
goes beyond the intuition. Intuition is like a gateway between scientific and woo, you know. But the mystical
Yeah.
practice is almost like the ultimate level of accessing that field of love that also is there wanting to help us. I
Mhm.
think what I'm hearing. And that's the ultimate level of cultivating. If someone is doing important work in the world, whether it's for themselves, for their family, for their community, or they're trying to actually do things like a number of people on this Humanity Rising and Jim Garrison, who's the founder, they're trying to do things to change the world. And we have big ambitions. You're holding a big field
Yeah.
and you need big help.
Oh,
And in some ways, it's not just like, isn't this beautiful? I feel this heart coherence. Isn't this beautiful? I'm having these very profound mystical experiences which have value in themselves, tremendous value. But also, in a weird way, it's instrumental in terms of if someone's trying to do good work in the world, we need all the help we can get. And there's this help that some ways, this field of love that you could call God is accessible to you. And as you go through this mystical journey, it's accessible in this greater depth and greater power as you were taking on bigger challenges in the world to be able to create
right.
meaning and navigate the meaning crisis and the meta crisis of the 21st century. In some ways, it's not only whole healing and whole and uplifting and beautiful, but also like necessary to strengthen us for everybody who's on this broadcast
Absolutely critical.
to do the work they want to do in the
Yeah.
world.
If you
And
can't hold steady, if you can't, and I don't mean perfect, right? Like we're human beings. You're going to have your moment when you're whatever. And then you're like, oh, but that's not the truth, right? I had my moment, but there's a bigger truth here. And for me, development is like this. It doesn't have to be like this. I think that's a masculine view that a lot of people resist. I'm fine with that. It's,
three-dimensional. Yeah.
yeah, expanding out.
Yeah.
The more you can hold steady
The
and hold
holding
it.
environment. The holding environment.
I know, that's it, right?
Yeah.
My dissertation was about, that's an energetic field, not a psychological state. But anyway, and the more we can first hold ourselves, we got to hold ourselves. If you're not holding yourself, give it up. It's all pretend. And then you can hold more and more. And when then you have people join you holding this, oh my gosh, you know, Hagelin's work, square root of 1%, changing the peace, you know, the level of peace in DC, like these are all real things. That's all science, straight science.
So
You can hold.
it's a beautiful journey, but I'm thinking to myself is that we've both been with Tom members of the Conscious Leadership Guild.
Sure.
And the interesting thing is that, you know, 20 years ago, it was avant-garde to talk about mindfulness practices in the business world. Like that was woo. And it's like, that was brave to talk about. Now it's standard procedure. You can walk into a meditation room in a corporation, right? And it'd be wonderful someday if we, in our lifetime, could be in a practice where something like wholeness, right? Undivided wholeness went from being woo, like, you know, yoga was weird 30 years ago, and then everyone had a yoga studio. Meditation is weird, everyone's meditating. Wouldn't it be great if we could get to wholeness in this field of love, that people, when they discover, they may find Buddha there, they may find God, they may find Jesus there, they may find who knows what.
It's all good.
But some kind of conception of there was this intelligence and
Bigger
care
than yourself.
bigger than yourself. That's sort of like, there's God, people asking about God, right? You know, it's like the source of ultimate meaning, but also it's a source of not just wholeness and help, like a mother comforting a child who's scared, but it's also like it's genuine help for us to do the work we're here to do in the world. And and imagine not having access to that. And but then through the kind of path journey you've been on to access that in a very deep way. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
So I know we're gonna wrap up soon here. We're gonna have an after chat, but I just wanted to mention, Jan, you have people, they want to be able to find you. Like I know you have meditations and talks on Insight Timer and other places. Can you talk about that just for a minute before we go?
Sure. Actually, the simplest place is I wrote a book a couple years ago, A Call to Wholeness, and it's you know, it's everywhere. It's a story of two women. I wrote it as a story, so it's not all blah, 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 and how they found their way through, how in a way they sort of did what I just shared with you. Obviously, there's some overlap here in my story and my own. And then the back part is some of the science and just real basic leadership literature and things like that, so you could actually read it. So if you want to have another experience of what we just talked about today, there's that. My website, janbyars.com. You see the spelling of my name right there. It's pretty easy. I do more custom than I do prepackaged. So I have so many things that I can offer, from traditional emotional intelligence or resiliency training for organizations to individual development and spiritual formation. So it's really.
There's the thing at the Insight Timer, you actually have some
Yes.
meditations on
So I think I have 6 free ones, and then I've posted 2 behind the paywall premium tracks. One of them called a field. What is it? Knowing Our Place in the Field of Love is an advanced one, and it's kind of what we talked about today. It's literally expanding your heart out for those people who are working with large groups of people around the world. It's an excellent one. If you already have a practice, if you already have some kind of silence practice, it's an excellent meditation. And then the other one's sleep, because if you're not sleeping, screw it, your biochemistry's so screwed up, it doesn't matter. You know, gets all the way down to a basic good night's sleep.
Yeah.
So
wonderful.
thank you.
So they can find out you can find your book. They can find some of the free ones and find out more about what you're doing and see if they want more of that. So
yeah.
But I think it's just I think there's been a lot of I must apologize. I've been paying attention to you and being in the field and not watching the chat. I've a few things go by, and I fear most of the comments I have seen go by seem to be very positive and very curious. And so I think we'll get to the after chat and people can talk to you directly.
Sounds great.
It was just really a privilege to be with you today, Jan, and I think it was a wonderful experience of the field of wholeness that you call love.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, that'll wrap up today's Humanity Rising. And tomorrow we're going to hear from Bob and Gloria Rees. They're going to be speaking about their multi-faith journey of, finding a postmodern experience of God, how they've accompanied other people in that journey, their own personal journey. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity to hear people who've been doing decades of work with people around the world, and accompaniment as well as service. This really, their work is basically, their development is very specifically, their development is tied to their ability to serve other people. And so it's like in service of that this, and I think it's a really good message for the end of the week, is that ultimately, the greatest gift is be able to serve other people in a joyful way. And I think that all this development, all this work is wonderful for us, but also makes us much more effective in our ability to serve others in the world. And then it was funny, through that service, you indirectly, because of who we are in the field of wholeness, you end up helping other people through their personal change. It's like, I was doing this work and then I came out a different person. What a wonderful side effect. Wouldn't it be great if we went to work and instead of feeling depleted, and whether it's nonprofit or profit or volunteer, we felt, instead of thinking, well, I helped a bunch of other people, but I feel exhausted, like, therapists and psychotherapists end up getting burnout and stuff like that. Imagine that we did our work and that work made us feel that we were transformed, not just helping others, but the work itself worked on us. And it can be done if we're in this field of wholeness when we're doing our work. So yeah. You're going to hear more about people who've been walking that talk for decades tomorrow. So I want to thank you, Jan, and this will close up our session, Humanity Rising.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll see you soon in the after chat.